right, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm here in Dubai. I've got a guest, Oliver, who is in Kent in the UK. So just a few hours of time difference. Thank you all for joining us for this week's edition for Epiq Thursdays, where we kind of speak with the movers and shakers when it comes to longevity, when it comes to wellness, when it comes to peak performance. So we can figure out, how can we decode those underlying secrets, protocols, and habits that allow the performers to kind of be at the high levels, whether it's an entrepreneur, whether it's a change maker, whether it's someone at home, whether it's a student. And this week we have an exciting guest. I've never had the pleasure of speaking with someone who's geeked out and focused on this topic about the inner child. How can we heal the wounds of our inner child? And Oliver is an expert in this because he's authored 22 books. So he's not just the information guy, he's the transformation guy as well. In the next 20 minutes, we'll talk about the strategies, the principles, and the ideas that all of us can adopt and adapt as needed to kind of suit our, personal, context, but also then move forward. So that by the end of it, you feel confident and capable to take that next step. So Oliver, good afternoon and welcome to Epiq Thursdays.
Thank you, Aman, for having me on this show. It's a great honor to be here and to look deeper into the important topics that you've laid out for this show.
So let's begin by understanding, when you talk about, our topic today is healing the wounds of our inner child. And, when I kind of reflected on that, I'm like, this may be the kryptonite that probably trips people off because they don't focus on that. They think about the big things, but they forget this piece, which is kind of in their sort of, in their genes, in their history. So when you talk about the inner child, can you elaborate just to make sure that we're all on the same page?
Well, one way to look at the inner child, because as you've just said, a lot of people might not even know what the inner child is, but one way to look at this would be to say that our inner child is our emotional self, or our inner child is our unconscious mind, because it is located, because I often see the body as the unconscious mind. So the inner child, as I see it, is located just above our stomach. It's around the area. So when we change our inner child, we change our unconscious mind. When we do that, then our life can transform in a big way. But of course, just as it can be hard to get in touch with our unconscious mind, it can be very hard to also get in touch with our inner child because of trauma and things like that.
So when you say the wounds of our inner child, I presume, again, that's like those deeper emotional wounds that probably our mind and our body and our self has gone through that we perhaps have never reflected on until we've been hit by a roller coaster at some point. So, is that the right way to kind of think of that? Or is there, I would say, a better way to kind of communicate it?
Yeah, I'd say it's a great way of looking at it. It's what takes place is we experience something painful, it's then too much for us to handle, and then as time goes on, we forget that we've forgotten about what took place. So it then defines our life, and as Carl Jung says, we lose touch with something and then we call it fate. But of course, there's simply what is going on within our own consciousness.
And does it always have to be this idea of, I reached a point and I suddenly had this awakening and I realized that, because of that, I now know what I've not been paying attention to. And now I can do something with it. Or is there something someone can consciously do before they hit that stage? When I guess there's no other way, there's no option, you kind of have to kind of deal with it. Is there a way to proactively, try to understand what that inner child desires or wants to kind of look at?
Yeah, I suppose what you're saying is there a way to repair the car before it blows up and then you have to get a new one? There is exactly a way of doing it, simply through becoming aware of how our unconscious mind is talking to us, through what is going on externally, the sensations in our body, and what continually irritates us, what causes us problems, paying attention to these external signs. Because through having all these defenses, we can't, as you're saying, go there directly, but it doesn't mean we have to wait till all hell breaks loose and our life basically comes to an end. We can go there before then. And the key is, as I've said, to become aware of these signs of defenses externally, our sensations and our relationships, the patterns in our life.
And when you've been working with people, individuals, groups, organizations about this, what has been most important for them to kind of, people want to kind of get a result. They want an outcome because they're in that doing mode. And before we went off air, you said, we sometimes have to forget we're doing, you have to kind of just be.
Yeah.
So, these hard hustling, hard driving executives or professionals, they want to get a result. So how do you help them get away from that first mindset? Because maybe that's what's holding them back and accessing that inner child as well, correct?
Well, of course, as you're talking about an area of life where it's very masculine, it's very much about force and doing, and there's a time and a place for that. But what I would bring to their attention is that, look, as we are not simply observers of our reality, if we're coming from a place of need and want and resistance, the very thing we desire can end up being pushed further away. And through letting go, for example, someone can be looking for something, it could be something fairly small like a screwdriver or a pencil, and they can be looking and looking, they can't find it. And then they say, okay, forget it. And they do something else. And then all of a sudden, what they're looking for turns up. So through that letting go, what they want to achieve can end up being achieved a lot faster through the letting go, through embracing the inner feminine and trusting in the process.
You spoke again earlier about the so-called healing paradox. Is that like a similar principle that, what you kind of let go of ends up kind of coming your way?
Yeah, exactly that, through having the need to do something, because when we're saying we need something, we're saying we haven't got it. That's what we're communicating to the universe. And through not having it, we end up creating more situations to not have. And this is the issue with, on one hand, wanting to heal something, and on the other, through wanting to heal it, it ends up being pushed. It's a bit like trying to pick up sand and holding it in our hands. It's just going to fall through. And it's this holding on. So it's a key thing. It's taken me a long time to learn, and I'm still learning it now. But it's a key thing to learn, this letting go and the being. But of course, to get to that stage, we can need to work through a lot of things before we can let go and start to do that.
You've authored, Oliver, so many books. In your mind, what have been the enduring principles as I'm sure that the journey has taken you different places as well. But as you look at those enduring principles that probably have stayed constant throughout that experience, if not been upgraded, what would those be?
Well, a big one is to be curious, because in each moment we might think that we can't do something, or we might not have access to the information we want. But through being curious, there's always a way that we can find it, especially with the internet now, through just typing in the right thing. And I think a lot of that is not so much about trying to find the right information, it's more about being in the right place internally. Because when we are in the right place, and what we need is more likely to just appear, seemingly out of nowhere. Another part is to be patient, to see this as a marathon, not a sprint, and to be persistent, and to look back on where we started. So for some to think, right, I started here, not to compare their journey with someone else's journey, but to compare it with their own, because that way they will be able to see that they are making progress. But if they compare their life with someone else's, then they're probably going to come up short.
So looking at the idea of being curious, being persistent, if someone has to become curious about their own situation and figure out what could be done to help them, I guess, move forward in their life, what could be that diagnostic, if I can use that phrase, experience or phase they can go through to kind of say, what, I think I need to kind of do some work on this, deep work, other work, etc. What could be that trigger point to kind of help them get a bit more opening up, like unpack the sort of layers and the stacks that are probably hidden below that inner child, as you were saying?
Well, I guess for one person, it could be to develop their ability to observe themselves. So to be able to just be with what is coming up, not to get attached. So they can start to get an idea of what is going on. Through this, along with having a journal, perhaps they can think I wrote this in the form, that they can write down every day for a week how they talk themselves, how they feel, just get an idea so they can start to get a sense of what is going on. And through doing this as well, they can see how, as I say, through the law of correspondence, how their inner world is reflecting back externally. So that's what I would say would be the first step.
And if someone was to help them, you spoke earlier as well that those individuals who probably are able to hold the space are the ones who can most assist in this situation, because they can at least create the opportunity for that sort of to appear as a possibility.
Yeah.
What would be the sort of skill set? I mean, if I'm sitting here and I've got someone in front of me who I feel needs to access their inner child, how can I help them? I mean, and because maybe sometimes I can see someone needs help or needs some sort of support or needs that sort of level of perspective, but that other person does not have the capacity. So how could I, as an observer on the other side, help them with this process with an intent to really help, as opposed to kind of profit from it?
Well, I suppose the main thing, the first step would for you to make sure that you are calm and centered and are not coming from a judgmental place, to be compassionate and open and to be accepting of all that person is going through. And through holding that space, through proving, another part of this as well is that if the other person, you might be someone who is very secure and present, but if the other person's got their own fears around opening up, perhaps they don't trust you, then they might not be able to fully let go and to surrender to that process. It's always a two-way dynamic. But if that person can, and depending on how well you know them, even just putting a hand, if you know them quite well, just putting a hand on their shoulder or something like that, finding out first to build that connection, and through having that external support, and that can allow them then to go where they might not go by themselves.
So I guess in the COVID world that we live in, where putting a hand around the shoulder may not be always possible, if I was to use the power of questions over here, what would be 1, 2, or 3 questions I should be sincere in asking, or at least putting out there in the open, to create the possibility of this conversation? Because at least this way I understand what's happening, right? Maybe I've got a dear friend, and this friend I feel is not appearing himself or herself because of how they're showing up. What could be the best question to start the dialogue or a process to understand, I'm curious, and here's something that can at least help me better understand and appreciate what can be done to help this person?
Well, I guess one thing you could do to build up the trust is perhaps talk about how you may have been through something yourself, to build up so that you understand them. And then through doing that, you could then say to the other person, ask them, so what is going on for you right now? How do you feel? What have you been dealing with at the moment? And as they do that, as they start to talk about their experience, then you can go down to a deeper layer, if they so feel comfortable to go to that layer to open up. And if they feel really relaxed, they might even start crying out some of their childhood wounds, their unmet childhood needs, if they feel comfortable enough to go to that stage.
So how does this, let's call it process or experience, connect with the notion of abandonment? Because you also spoke of that earlier before we kind of went on. How do we connect this notion of healing the wound and the notion of abandonment at the same time?
Well, of course, the adult version of them wasn't abandoned. As a child, let's say as a child, they were abandoned. And another thing I would add is that although it is seen as, excuse me, inner child work, we all have many different inner children, or many different split off parts within us. So there could be many different cells within them that are carrying the trauma of being abandoned. So through external support and their adult self being there for their child self, they can give the part of them the chance to express what it wasn't able to express all those years ago And as these parts are able to do that, then they can begin to integrate with their adult self, and that adult self becomes stronger. So because it was when they were children or a child, they were abandoned, that's the connection.
So when you are saying abandonment, is it like abandoned as in, left to fend for themselves, or they were deprived of certain experiences because, they were abandoned in that setting, either they were embarrassed? I mean, like, how do you kind of define abandonment? Because to me, like, that could take in many, many aspects, right?
Yeah, well, I would see it as there being two ways. So one way is that there was no one there for them. So they were left, there was no one there. And secondly is the emotional abandonment. So there were people there, but they weren't present. So it wasn't possible for them as a child to connect to the person. It's a bit like physically they were there, but emotionally and mentally they were somewhere else. So it's a bit like going to someone's house, ringing the bell, but no one's there.
Something that I've been studying over the past several months is the idea of flow states. How do you get into those states of high levels of physical and mental performance such that all the right neurochemicals are firing and you're able to get into that sort of high state of flow and performance, which athletes, performers, musicians, etc., can get into. And of course, the connection I'm building in my head is that, of course, if someone has got unaddressed wounds from the inner child, they obviously cannot get into that state of high performance, optimal performance, because there will always be this chink which they've either not addressed or don't want to address. So as you've worked with people, clients, or you've spoken on stages, where have you seen the connection between these topics that we're discussing, the idea of healing, trauma, wounds, abandonment, and high performance?
Well, what I would say is high performance it's not usually an area that I have much experience, but I suppose it's simply when someone can fully show up and be their best self. That's probably similar to what you're talking about. And so I'm not quite sure about, so the question would be, what is the connection between resolving these issues and someone being able to perform at their best? Is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to figure whether if someone's not either being aware of these underlying areas will prevent them from showing up at that level, which is truly, I guess, reflective of their best self, and they feel fully alive and present.
Yeah, well, it's that I think it's that Buddhist saying, wherever you go is where you'll be. So no matter what setting they're in, their wounds are going to show up in some shape or form. And that, of course, is going to make it hard. One example is, of course, the imposter syndrome, which seems to be quite a popular diagnosis these days, where someone gets to the level and they don't feel as though they deserve to be where they are. Of course, as I see it, there's a part of them, probably call it the child part, that is not that. It still sees, it causes them to see themselves as someone who is incapable, doesn't deserve it, is not at the level. And even though their adult self they put in, they deserve it, they're at that level. This other part of them is creating conflict, and that can cause them to sabotage it and just simply not to be able to truly appreciate what they've earned.
So final couple of things, Oliver, is one is, my coach, one of my coaches mentioned that, how you do something is how you do everything. And I'm just wondering, whether as you see people expressing certain patterns from their inner child, that they end up becoming constantly repeating in different areas. And again, that may sound like an obvious thing, but how, I guess, damaging is that to someone's presence in the world, because they're kind of projecting that inner child. Everyone's seeing it except this person, because they're oblivious to it, perhaps.
Yeah, it's the defense mechanism, repetition compulsion. But like the film Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. So it's the same things again and again and again and again. And through repeating the same situations, circumstances, and events, they obviously feel the same, think the same, and And then when that does happen and someone gets annoyed about that, they then feed into that reality again. And one way to look at it would be to say that it is a way for us to become aware of what we need to resolve. So those things are showing up. This is great. Another way is that we're trying to resolve what we couldn't resolve very early on. So if we can get something, let's say, for example, we were unable to receive the love that we wanted as children, and we end up creating the same situation again and again and again. But because we're coming from the same place, we end up then manifesting another person who can't give us that love. So it's pretty much a dead loss. But this is where grieving these unmet needs, getting in touch with them and crying out the pain, can then start to put an end to these incredibly frustrating patterns that we can experience.
Yeah, I think metabolizing the grief is very important. Otherwise, we end up kind of just holding it up and it doesn't really help us. So I completely get that. Final thing, Oliver, like I said before, we could have spoken for many hours because you've got so many angles you work with, is if you were to leave an audience that's watching this either now or later on in our various channels, 1, 2, or 3 things they can work with to help them in this journey, what would you suggest they do?
Well, I would say one thing is something called total release experience. And this is a technique for healing trauma. It's basically a way to shake it off. Like animals, and that is very good for getting more connected to our body, releasing stress and anxiety. Another one is the havening technique, which is very good again for dealing with negative emotions. And another thing that's very good for opening up the heart. Opening up the heart is ceremonial grade cacao. That's very good for becoming more loving and connected to ourselves and letting go. So those 3 things is what I would recommend if someone is committed. Give all those things a go, and they should be very much on their way.
Brilliant. So if you were to kind of, as a parting comment, set up a challenge for someone to think of, do this for the next 7, 30 days, whatever, by way of either reading, journaling, writing, what would you say someone does? Because this gets them on the way.
Well, I would say to try the things I've just recommended. They can both be learned online, and just keep on doing those things. Not every day, but continually do things, and to write in a journal as well, to get their thoughts down, to understand how they talk to themselves and how they feel, and to work through what comes up, and also to become very clear about what matters to them, what they want to contribute, what brings them joy and fulfillment, because it's often through the giving, as they say, not the receiving, that brings us meaning. So that's what I'd say.
Wonderful. Brilliant. Oliver, thank you very much for your insights, and everyone else for joining us. Extremely insightful. I've learned not just those 3 things that you left us at the end. I've not tried the ceremonial cacao. I think I should be kind of missed an opportunity to do that. Friend of mine
Yeah, give it a go.
was running a retreat in Bali a few months ago, but I could not make it. Oh, actually, not Bali. It was in Peru. I'm sorry. But I think COVID prevented us from going there. So hopefully another time when that becomes possible. But again, everyone, thanks for joining. Oliver, thanks for being with us. Look forward to seeing others for our next Epiq Thursday show. Take care, and
thank you, Aman.
Limitless, stay epic.